that the money is invested in one person of the family to get his way to Europe. When I visited Greece 3 weeks ago, and I was on a boat in the Aegean with the Greek Navy, and I spoke for a day with some of the refugees, they told me that they have prepared for the trip, and the ticket from Aleppo to Munich was basically in the $3,000 to $4,000, and they would make it in 48 hours. So these are refugees and migrants and people who are under threat and pressure. They make very rational decisions on the market. If I look as humanitarian to this, that's not a good deal in terms of protection concerns of people. But it is the result of restrictive policies which basically create a black market with a black market price. And I think it is important that we are aware that migrants do not blindly start to walk. They take informed decisions, and depending on how governments organize the price on the market, the restrictions, the legislative pieces, the opportunities, the alternative routes, the protection concerns that they offer to migrants, depending on the whole mix of everything, the decisions will be taken. The result will be very different in terms of ambitions of humanitarian protection and assistance to those people. They will get a bad deal under certain circumstances, and they will get a better deal under other circumstances. May I just respond to one or two more questions from Jennifer? Why are we outspoken at a certain moment and less outspoken on the other? I have never made outspokenness and confidentiality as a sort of a question of principle. It's a tool to achieve an objective. I think the objective as a humanitarian is to assist and protect people of our concern. If we want to have access to detention facilities in whatever conflict in which we work, confidentiality is normally a good tool to have access. So we may shut up. If we believe that politics in Europe at the present moment are sufficiently open, and these are issues which are discussed in the public space in Europe, there is no functionality of being silent. This is part of the European debate. And so it may be more conducive to address some issues in the public space as everybody else does in the public, pronounce itself in the public space. But I may not make this as a doctrine to treat with the European Union. Of course we are interested in having a diplomatic, quiet conversation with the Europeans on the use of force, on rules of procedures, everything that I mentioned beforehand. And we may not try to have this conversation necessarily each and every day in the public space. But I think it is important as humanitarians to look at the contextual situation and the dynamics of political decision making. And the objective is not to be confidential or outspoken. The objective is to assist and protect people. What is conducive? Sometimes it's outspokenness, and sometimes it's silence. It's a difficult pondering that we are doing each and every day. I know that when I talk too much about my concerns on protection in Europe, I may have some right-wing parties which will express themselves negatively on the ICRC. That's a risk. So we have to ponder risks and opportunities as migrants do when they take decisions. Humanitarians have to take sophisticated decisions and try to be smart on when we speak in public and when we speak in private and when we look for practical solutions. there is no point in continuously just arguing about violations and about concerns. I don't want to go into history of the debate on migration in Europe as a man who has expressed concerns. Nobody lives from concerns. I need to express concerns in order to start a debate on solutions. That's the functionality of raising concerns. Afterwards, we will have phases of negotiations and debate, and these phases will have to find practical solutions on what the best deal is that we get at the present moment, on having assurances for the European Union to protect its borders, and at the same time to have people who have legitimate protection needs to come to Europe and to find protection on the European continent. This is what we are looking at the present moment. With regard to medical assistance, I think we, in Syria, I have already with students at Brandeis today, I have spoken about some of the dilemmas in which we are and the characteristics of humanitarian frontline negotiation is that it is negotiations under big dilemmas. It's not finding the common interest in a complex environment. It's a difficult type of negotiations. We have principles and laws with regard to medical assistance in conflict, and we all know what these principles and laws say. The problem is they are not implementable as such, given the conditions in which we are. So each and every day we make a difficult choice on what is an acceptable trade-off of assisting medical facilities, mobile medical clinics, supporting medical professions in Syria, and what is an unfeasible compromise, which is compromising the principles under which we operate. And it's a difficult choice. The medical assistance in many conflicts, and in particular in the Syrian conflict, has been the most difficult dilemmas with which we have been confronted. No other sector of humanitarian assistance has been exposed to so much pressure as the medical profession in the Syrian conflict and in many other conflicts nowadays. You can deliver water and sanitation services even in Raqqa. We have done that over the last 2 years. ICRC has fixed water installation in Raqqa, in the heart of Islamic State. It was not, and we haven't done it in any hidden way from the Syrian government. With the permission of the Syrian government and the authorities in Raqqa, we have done this type of humanitarian work. Not possible with medical, because medical in the meantime is seen not as a particularly protected area of activities of humanitarian actors, but as a strategic and as a part of a military strategy. And this is what concerns us most in some of the patterns of the conflict in which we are working. We have enlarged the basket of medical assistance in Syria over time because I think we have managed to establish trustful relations with the parties. But the trustful relations are not sufficient at the present moment to have anything which we would like and would define as important medical assistance delivered. But we do more today than we have ever done before. But here again, we are in the sort of strange situation where we do more. We have doubled our medical program in Syria in the last 12 months, but double is too little. Last word with regard to tracing, we have considerably stepped up our work on tracing in cooperation with the national societies, with the whole Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. If I look at our services today, we have not only scaled up, but we have also modernized our tracing. It's completely digital at the present moment. It has face recognition software which allows us to match requests from one side to another. We have larger successful rates than ever before in tracing people. We use information systems in order also to get more literate and to use the data that we have from tracing services in order to have a smarter vision on what the protection situation looks like in many of the places. It's some of the critical work that we are doing at the present moment, including on the European continent. We have scaled up and built a tracing service in Eastern Europe. We have tracing officers in Greece as well, and of course one of the big advantages that I mentioned beforehand is that as a Red Cross and Red Crescent movement we are in all the countries and we are along migration routes. So tracing services is one of the important issues on which we have scaled, we have modernized, we have considerably enlarged our operations. It is one of the quite successful services. There are three things at the present moment operationally that we do in Europe, except of being concerned on policies and their implementation. It's tracing services, it's visits in migrant detention facilities, and it's dead body management, because we have the largest group of forensic experts helping the Mediterranean countries deal with the dead bodies taken out of the Mediterranean. So that's three operational activities for the time being, which ICRC has engaged to, and where we built our operational activities in Italy, in Greece, in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but more may come. As Gregor said at the beginning, we wouldn't have thought to do that 2 years ago, and we don't know what we will be doing in 2 years' time.
Do we have time for... Okay, so let me open the floor, please.
Peter, let me thank you very much and for this very clear presentation, and the ICRC for the work you've done over the decades, and the panel and the center. And I would agree with your assessment of the Syrian situation and what your can and should do at this time, et cetera, et cetera. My question is about what your long-term planners and strategic planners and so on and so forth are thinking in regard to what Jennifer Leaning described as stressed migration, and the future of stressed migration over the next 30 years. As you know, half the population of North Africa and the Middle East is under 30. These characteristics of mass unemployment and corrupt and violent governments and the failure of state services and insecurity are universal virtually in Algeria and Egypt and Libya and Yemen and so on and so forth. What does the ICRC see in regard to the broader framework of the issues you've described vis-a-vis Syria and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan, which strike me as being somewhat less, what would I say, exigent than they may be in some of these other countries along the Mediterranean border. So the question is about the larger framework for the Syrian situation.
Thank you very much. Could you please...
Thank you very much. As a German, I agree with you that the numbers we are talking about are small. Nevertheless, the panic we see, not only in Europe, but in particular there, about these numbers are a little bit difficult then to understand. The political climate has changed in the middle of last year. and it may have to do with the immediate rise of a few more thousands or 100,000 of people coming. Now, two issues could have stopped things earlier. I mean, even now, more activity around Syria. I mean, in the refugee camps, so far I understand, the situation is very, very poor. International help is not coming, and besides of the panic as such. And the other is, who has not seen and why the huge numbers of people walking from the south of Europe to Germany and more ahead, and has not been able to react earlier. So it's a kind of a mystery what's going on there. So all in all, I agree with you. These are small numbers, and we should react more responsible with the situation. But the question even then arises, why are some states, let's say Slovakia and others like that, are so much worried about the dozens of more refugees than last year?
Thank you. We have a question in the last row on the right.
So Jennifer raised the issue of climate change, and since it wasn't addressed till now, I'd appreciate if I'd like to bring it up again. I mean, do we have any kind of international legal regime that will be adequate to handle the number of refugees from basically unlivable areas of the world, those most impacted by climate change? Drought in South Africa, rising ocean levels in Bangladesh, for example. There's many, many examples.
Thank you very much. We have one more in the second row here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maurer, Jennifer, and our colleague. I would like to ask Dr. Maurer, having talked with people in the region, many people tend to criticize the neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and as Melanie rightly said, they're in different institutional structures. But the setting in of border controls, of security concerns, which are increasingly making humanitarian action difficult. Everyone else is insisting on it, so it seems to me somehow a legitimate concern. And having spoken with a couple of representatives of these countries, there seems to be quite a tendency to believe that sooner than later the prospects for elections in Syria could come. Because what I'd rather like us to perhaps see, after having raised so many really valuable issues, the best humanitarian action does not replace political decisions and actions. You said it yourself. And there I'd like to come back to Staffan de Mistura's work, that the Russians have come on board. The bombarding has become less. Kerry was in Moscow. There seems to be a way open to some sort of cooperation, that perhaps one could think of some compact plan. And of course, the EU-Turkey agreement is on the margin of international law. UNHCR is not part in it. It is only mentioned as a key actor in the resettlement process to provide support and supervision, and it's supposed to be implemented as from yesterday, or yesterday before, under the supervision of the European Commission Verve, with 4,000 people, none of them, any of them, one might say, trained in refugee protection and procedures. I think we should see how the implementation comes along, but basically my question is, how do you view, looking at the overall picture and solutions, that a political process might become possible? I mean, Staffan de Mistura has worked tirelessly to get parties on board. The Islamic front is not part of the negotiation, but how do you see it from your perspective?
Thank you very much. I think we'll go back to here, these big questions.
Yeah, and a lot of those questions are addressed to
the citizen Peter Maurer and not to the humanitarian Peter Maurer, because as a humanitarian I have little to respond if I want to maintain some neutral, impartial and independent posture with regard to some of those difficult questions. Huh? As a humanitarian, we don't speculate about the larger population movements in the future. Our main concern is to be prepared to react when it counts fast. So that's a typical humanitarian approach. We don't care too much about the different scenarios. The only thing is that you have to be fast when things go bad. And in that sense, again, as I mentioned in responding to Jennifer, we see different possibilities, and the fact that there are a lot of underprivileged youth does not mean necessarily that we will see this or that kind of migration. What is very clear to me as a citizen and as a political observer is that the tension that we have built in the international system are not sustainable and will lead to some form of conflict, movement, whatever. You don't know exactly in which combination it comes and in which timing and sequencing. But I mean, the result of what we have seen is also the result of deep injustice that we were not able to address over the last 15 years. And it has to do with a sort of obnubilating rhetorics of politics, which tried us to make understand that the world was developing in the right way, and the Millennium Development Goals have contributed to addressing justice and development and led to peace in many parts of the world. And while this is partly true for some few regions of the world, it is unfortunately not true for many parts of the world. And if we do not address the underlying consequences of underdevelopment and injustice, we will always have one form or the other of violence and conflict at the end of the sequence. And then we will have humanitarians trying to mitigate. That's the game as it is in town now, or on the international system, and I don't see at the present moment major shifts. Now, you are right that there are great diplomatic efforts by Staffen, by the Russians and the Americans coming to senses and obviously making a calculation that the continuation of all those conflicts without being addressed in common by them together would be a bigger price than just trying to forge some compromise. That's probably what made them sit together, because my interpretation is that the powers in Europe, the United States, the Russians, have seen over the last 12 to 18 months that they were basically losing any control of what was happening in Syria. And I think that's what made them sit together and hammer out a political compromise. And you can only hope that this reasoned approach will pick up, will gain momentum, will lead to a credible political process. But of course it's a very political question that you ask me. I don't know how this political process will be timed and sequenced and shaped and organized. I can only hope that it will create an atmosphere which will allow us to address some of the stark humanitarian impacts of this conflict, which will continue for quite some time, even if cessation of hostilities should be successful. To my knowledge, there is a lot of talk about climate change and displacements, but there is no sort of legal framework or international framework addressing it in any credible way. We are cautious today when we interpret population movement to pin it down to a legal framework because it narrows the perspective. I think the whole issue of today's migration movement is that you can't really pinpoint this or that movement as being the consequence of violence, poverty, climate change, or any combination of the three, or some other combinations. I mean, pastoral movements in the Sahel have been a consequence of drought, and the drought is a consequence of climate change. But pastoral movements are not only the consequence of climate change, they are also moving because of tensions in the communities and because of violence in the communities, and they are poor. So alternatives are scarce. So one of the problems that we continue to struggling with in the international community is that we have many reasons which make people move. And we have neatly separated legal instruments to deal with those movements. But the reality is more complex. And therefore there is this discrepancy between the legal infrastructure to address people on the move and the reality and complexity of motives which makes people move. Legally, you are either a legal migrant or a refugee or an IDP or a Palestinian. That's the four categories of which we have, the international community has offered legal frameworks to put them into a case. But what is with regard to the Palestinian who moved from violence in Yarmouk and becomes a refugee in whatever country, you see when you start to play with those categories how artificial those categories are and how much more comprehensive we need an approach in order to understand those dynamics. But here again, my point here at Harvard is, this is the interest of having practitioners and experiences from the field mirrored in sound legal research and policy research and accompanied by methodological input of a great organization like this one. And that's the whole interest of having such a dialogue, not only as we had it in the past, but also continue in the future.
I hope you share my view that this was a very important conversation. And thank you so much to Weizmann family for making that possible. Thank you to Harvard Humanitarian Action Initiative for making that possible. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Melanie. And most of all, thank you so much, Peter Maurer.